Zelman, how are you? Really exciting today, our very first panel. So run us through who we've got on today.
So we're taking a bit of a risk today, and I hope it does work out, but we're getting three people on at the same time. We have Shane Quinn from Quintessential, Alton Abrahams from Ash Morgan, and Wayne Lasky from MaxCap. These three men, work in different parts of the market, but effectively run, private investment houses. Whether they're lending, developing, refurbishing, repositioning assets, they're between the three of them, they control some very big precincts and properties and have made some very big moves. So it's exciting to get a very wide spread of what's happening across Australia, across each property sector, and also how investment houses like these groups are managing their investors during this period.
Yeah, I think that it is interesting. I mean, particularly the cross sector, like talking office, residential, industrial. It's going to be a really interesting take on how they've seen the market, and retail. So we can't forget.
Don't forget why I'm here.
Exactly. So in the calendar this week, next week we do have another great guest coming on,
yes.
Mark Liebler from Arnold Block Liebler.
Have you finished the book yet?
No, I'm halfway through. So I am getting through. I've been watching too much Netflix, and I need to concentrate.
Nerida, and we should wish each other luck on this panel discussion, because it could be a big, argument on whose market is better and whose investment house is bigger, or it could be a pretty productive. They're three very, very specialized and successful individuals and companies that have really shaped certain sectors of the market. So I feel very privileged, and I know they're all coming on to be interviewed by you, and I'm just here for the ride. But I feel very privileged that this is happening this week, and we're continuously evolving. If anyone has any suggestions of who they want us to interview or how we can improve our interviews, I got some feedback last week that my voice was going in and out, so I got myself a microphone. So we do read the feedback, we do appreciate it, and we are trying to make this as productive and informative as we can.
Great. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to some really strong opinions. Thank you all for coming on. It's just so great to have you on. We're looking forward to some very, very strong opinions, as we know that you all do have strong opinions on the market and also on the various sectors of property. Starting off though around COVID and how you guys have been coping through it. So I just maybe we'll start with you, Alton. So how has your experience working in the industry, working throughout your career, prepared you for COVID?
Look, I think for us, I don't think anybody could be prepared for COVID sort of, emotionally. It's been a pretty sort of, I guess, surreal experience to think that, in 2020, the world's been sort of brought to a standstill by a virus. I mean, there's obviously very smart people who saw this coming. I'm not one of them. But I think, look, certainly the lived experience in Sydney is very different to Melbourne from a day-to-day perspective. Look, from a work experience, what sort of what experience and what lessons we've learned from previous crises that prepared us for this. I think the GFC from a property perspective was much worse than this. That was a debt-driven expansion. The retracement of values was pretty severe and reasonably quick when it became clear what was going on. We haven't seen that much of that yet, I would stress. And the lessons we learned from that period was keep your gearing under control. So we've got average gearing across the portfolio of under 50%. With where interest rates are at the moment, that's left us in a pretty strong position. So I'd say that probably the biggest lesson from previous crises was manage your gearing and keep your gearing under control.
Great. How about you, Shane? You're obviously in Melbourne. You're in lockdown at the moment. What lessons have you learnt throughout your career that's really put you in good stead going into this crisis?
Yeah, I guess going through the GFC and cycles prior to that, the thing you've got to continue to do is look outward. I think in a crisis, people start to look inward and you can lose opportunity. And there is opportunity in crisis, which is it's there to be taken. So as a group, we're continuing to double down on our marketing. We're going harder in terms of communication, and very fortunately, our business has been built internally on culture. So we're doubling down on all of those things. But we're probably a little bit different in terms of our thoughts at the moment. We think there'll be a lag in terms of real opportunity being coming to the market. We think everyone's bunkering down at the moment, and there will be opportunity on the other side of this, but when that is, I don't know. But we're taking all of those learnings and continuing to try and be positive and look outward. And again, that's not a false hope. It's not fake hope. That's the way the business has been set up to continue to look forward for that opportunity. And I think our team's digging in and doing a good job.
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally that maintaining confidence is such a key issue now, particularly in Melbourne. Wayne, you're also in Melbourne, and yesterday you mentioned as well that communication was such a key for your clients. So are your learnings quite similar to Alton and Shane, or is there something else that sort of has come through over the past few months?
I mean, I would concur with the other two guys for sure. I mean, I think we started our business in 2007. Obviously had to deal and navigate through the GFC. There was no blueprint for doing so at that time. And I would say a lot of similarities, albeit a completely different form of crisis. Similarly, no blueprint to navigate through these times. So, having agility and being able to operate with equanimity, which, is what Shane was outlining, which is maintaining that outward perspective and looking for opportunities, is precisely what we've been doing too, Nerida.
If the three of you could sit down for a meeting with Daniel Andrews, Josh Frydenberg, and Scott Morrison, as a collective group with your influence, what would you be telling these three leaders now? Or asking them?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I just want decisive leadership. Whatever the policies are, decisive leadership, clear leadership is absolutely paramount in crisis, and I'd be looking for that. So that'd be my 2 bit.
Alton?
Do you think we're getting it, Shane? Do you think we are getting clear leadership?
Oh, look, I think everyone in Victoria has fatigue, and I'm not going to go there in Victoria, but I think at a federal level we absolutely are. So I guess you can read into that. I think at a Victorian level, no, I don't think we've got clear vision, and it's lacking.
Alton?
I think there'd probably be a discussion in two parts. One about sort of on the other side of this and now, and I think I echo Shane's sentiments about clear leadership and decisive leadership. And I think one of the challenges we're facing is the lack of consistency across the country. The border issues across the country are challenging. The lack of consistency in approach in the virus management, I think, is hugely challenging, and challenging for business on a whole bunch of levels, which I don't think have been thought through properly. And there's quite a bit of parochialism going on, which is a bit sad to see as being an Australian. I've never identified myself as a New South Welshman. I don't think I've ever used that phrase in my life. Aside from when it happens to be state of origin time between New South Wales and Queensland. So I've sort of been really shocked by the parochialism that's taken place across the country. I never expected it in Australia. I think the second part is the old cliche, don't waste a good crisis. There'd be 3 words I'd be talking to the leaders about is reform, reform, reform. We've been screaming out for reform as a business community for nearly 15 years, from tax, IR, planning, immigration. I think the opportunities are massive if the leaders have the courage to take them.
It is a shame to have these border closures. It's such a critical thing for us to operate in a much more positive business environment.
I mean, my 8-year-old knows the name of every single premier in Australia. Has any kid ever cared about who the premiers were in New South Wales?
Probably the health ministers as well, I reckon.
It's amazing how politics has become so important in every individual, no matter their age.
Federally, there has been strong leadership, and the area of federal policy that I'm probably most focused on is our foreign policy with China. And it's a highly debatable point. Yes, you need to stand up for what you believe in. Do you need to take the lead globally in that approach? No, I don't believe so. And we've suffered in recent times. When you've got headlines like Australia is like a piece of chewing gum on the bottom of China's heel, that is not a positive situation for Australia, but we are critically important trading countries, and I'm hopeful that the relationship and the retribution phase the relationship will come on a more even footing, but it is precariously positioned at the moment.
Shane, we might come back to you and just talk about our favourite sectors. All of us do have a favourite property sector, and it does adjust over time. So what's your number one favourite, and why? Why is your outlook for that sector so positive?
Yeah, well, we're predominantly in office and industrial around the country, and we've loved those sectors, and office is very topical at the moment. So I guess I'll have a crack at that one first. Look, I think we will go back to office, and I can tell you I'm as dumb as a box of hammers. I need to be around smart people. So the sooner I can get back in the office and collaborate with people, I'll be doing that. But I think as humans, we will revert to the norm. And in crises, we tend to forget. I know this is a major crisis, and when you're in it, you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I do think we will get back into offices. But I think the biggest thing for me is the take-up of technology through this period. And that adaptation of technology is a real threat to office in the future. Digitising jobs, and if you can work remotely and you don't need to be around a team, number one, does the employer need to employ you in that city with a cost base in Sydney that's high, opposed to Adelaide, Darwin, India, somewhere? So you can outsource that role, but longer term, over the next 5 to 10 years, if that technology is taken up, I see digitisation of a lot of jobs, and that's a threat, and I'm a bit more worried about that down the track. So I've got my eye on that, but after the pandemic, I think we will be back in the office. I think now's the time to be very conservative in terms of your assumptions when entering the purchase of an office, be that let up, incentives, where rents are going to go. So plenty to work on, but I'm still positive in that space for the right assets. And then industrial's the darling child, as you know. I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think industrial's no different to office. There's going to be disruption in that space. I think fully high bay, fully automated warehousing could eradicate a lot of those bigger, chunkier sheds, more intensive land use closer to the city, driverless cars down the track. So there's a lot of disruption in the darling child of industrial that I think people are underestimating. And I think what a prime grade shed today is may not be a prime grade shed in 4 or 5 years' time. So people need to be a bit aware of what they're buying and the prices they're paying. So watch and see on that space. I'd be buying land-rich industrial more than improvement-rich.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you're right. It has been the darling child. It's been such a shift over the past 10 years into how people are viewing it. Wayne, how about you? Is residential your number one, or what's your number one sector at the moment?
Yeah, well, it may surprise some, but the residential sector's been performing incredibly strongly through the 6 or 7 months that we've seen. I think you might have seen just very recently, CBA have changed or adjusted their forecasts. Pretty material revision too, from a 10% drop in house prices back to 6%. So we have seen very strong performance, resilience in that sector. Look, from my perspective, we're fundamentally driven, and I look at the undersupply of housing. The country has been, in the main, undersupplied since the Second World War. Leading into this crisis, I was of the view that in the next 2 to 3 years, the big story was going to be Australia's housing crisis. The undersupply was going to, in our estimations, exceed 200,000. Clearly that has abated, and perhaps the crisis is of some benefit in that regard. We saw a material pre-crisis pricing downturn. So that was in Melbourne and Sydney. That has also assisted the sector going into this crisis. So the timing there was good. A lot of conversation around population growth. So clearly on the supply side, that has fallen off the edge of a cliff. New housing starts at record lows. But the population story is probably less well understood. We've been growing at about 1.4% per annum for the past 40 years, 1.65% in fact for the last 15 years, which is the highest growth rate of any Western country in the world by some distance. And so, there will be a drop in population that will be felt in the short term. But, we also have over 2 million temporary visa holders here in Australia, and more than 50% of the permanent visas come from that pool. So whilst that has dropped from 2.4 million temporary visa holders, that's still a very large pool to draw on. So I don't think the population story is going to be quite as severe in terms of its downturn as others out there.
Yeah, I hope not. How about you, Alton? What's your favourite sector at the moment?
So look, we've got a reasonably sector diverse portfolio. This retail, large format, and prime and A-grade office. Large format has held up remarkably well through this period. I think it's probably been the star performer, sort of outside of industrial, as far as occupancy, rent collection, and leasing transactions. So that's been really interesting. Obviously, it's driven by a confluence of factors: work from home, the fact that people have got money in their pockets with nowhere to spend it. So that's been really interesting to watch. Sort of prime and A-grade CBD office is probably our preferred sector. We share some of Shane's views, but what we don't share is this view that suburban office is going to have this big run and everyone's going to depart from the CBDs and going to want to go and put offices all over the place. We think the office is a really important part of the way society functions. There's a statistic running around about, I think it's 30 or 40% of people meet their spouses at work. If you added that to, meeting people at sort of after work and the bars around the city, people predicting the doom of the office, I would say to them, be careful what you wish for, because that would see us as a society go down a path which I can't even work out what that would mean. So we're still looking at prime and A-grade CBD office on the eastern seaboard capital cities. We're looking carefully at lease-up risk and where incentives are going to go over the next few years. But we are a big believer that the CBDs are not dead. They're just having a little rest.
How are you going to with the sublease market that's starting to creep into Melbourne and Sydney CBDs that owners are now starting to compete with?
Yeah, well, there's going to be a lot of sublease in Melbourne, and I'm hearing tracks of up to over 100,000 square metres already. So, yeah, well, I heard one comment yesterday of 100,000 metres. That's going to put a lot of pressure because obviously that's just mitigating risk for those tenants and just trying to get any cost they can in the door. So they're really not looking for an economic rent that a landlord would otherwise. They're just trying to mitigate their loss. So that's going to put a lot of pressure around the markets. But look, there's going to be some things to play out. And as I said, our house view is there's going to be a lag before these opportunities or distress really hits the market. And we probably see it Easter next year being a time when it's going to play out then. So I think landlords have to get ready. And we're certainly being very aggressive. We see that we're not going to do any leases in the next 12 months if we're not super proactive. So we're hitting the market very hard and trying to be the first out of the gates. And we've been very successful in Perth. We've done 35% of a building over there by, I guess, accepting that the next 12 months is pretty dead for us. So we've put that towards incentive. So it's working in our favour.
Quintessential have invested very heavily in Geelong and other outer suburbs where you're building your own office precincts and communities. With all this CBDs, people leaving CBDs and going into outer suburb offices, is that fueling that strategy to go further? Or like Alton, do you think the CBDs will come back after this?
Look, I do think the CBDs are going to come back and people want to go back into the CBDs. But if you look at Victoria and Melbourne as a city, it doesn't have a second CBD essentially. And so years ago in the GFC, in fact, we went and bought a lot of assets in Parramatta. We really seen the benefit of that as a second city to the Sydney CBD. And Sydney has all of these other nodes that Melbourne just doesn't have. So we've seen the opportunity of being in Geelong as a second city to the Melbourne CBD. That's played out very well for us, and I think it's going to continue. If for those of us that live in Melbourne, if you live on the west of the Westgate Bridge, to cross the Westgate Bridge is a very trying time in the morning, and that could be anywhere from an hour and a half to half an hour. So if you head in the other direction to Geelong, it's a very clear run. Lifestyle's easy in Geelong. People want to be close to schools and all of the great things that are in Geelong for their family and upbringing. So it's one of the fastest growing cities in Victoria and precincts. So we're going to double down on that and continue to grow that out. And we're being, approached by a number of big corporates looking to take advantage of having alternate space on the other side of the Westgate, and we're the benefit of that over time. Yeah.
All right, well, that brings us to residential, Wayne. So one of the things you mentioned was CBA downgrading their forecasts, or not downgrading, but reducing their forecast for price declines. I think at one stage they were saying there'd be a 30% drop. One of the things, though, that is supporting the housing market is the fact that the banks are still being very accommodating with people that have mortgages, and if they do withdraw that support, then that could have quite a big impact. I mean, what's your view on the banks supporting mortgage holders, and do you think that they can continue to do so through the crisis?
Well, I think the answer to that question is they have and they will continue to, because there is an inordinate amount of money coming into the system. The federal government has made the job of the four majors in particular, but the whole banking sector that much easier to support Australians. And it's important at this point in time. And, look, I think also not lost on the major banks that it's an ideal opportunity to restore their brands for a post-Royal Commission, that we shouldn't lose sight of that. So I don't see there being a major change in that respect, personally.
How about settlements? I mean, that's the other one that everyone has. Well, people don't talk about it so much now, but I mean, are you still seeing high levels of settlement, and do you think that will change over the next few months?
Well, the settlement stats are quite shocking in a positive way. We were expecting to see far higher defaults. And in actual fact, just last month we settled over 1,500. If we're talking the residential sector, over 1,500 lots with less than a 3% default rate, which is pretty close to the historical average, and completely immaterial from a senior debt lender's perspective, and quite comfortable also from the equities perspective, quite frankly. So that's been very positive to see. But what I would say in that respect is there is a lot of money floating around in the system. Interest rates are very low, and values are typically holding presently, to the extent that there was a lot of product that came out onto the market with and exchanged hands at considerably lower values. That would likely be the catalyst to seeing some revaluations in place, and then of course issues with respect to the amount of equity and potentially distress further afield.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that we're seeing is a very, very sharp uptick in rental listings in Melbourne CBD. So I think they're up about 2,500 since the start of the crisis. What do you think will happen to this, pretty high vacancy rate over the next 12 months? I mean, it is very dependent on foreign students returning and a continuation of the migration rate.
Yeah, it is. And I think I'm a little less concerned about the immediacy bias of looking at a sector in isolation over a 12-month period. I think when we talk about the residential sector, socio-demographics are really important. And therein we're talking about 20-year trends. And that's something, at MaxCap, we're very confident in establishing strategy around. If you're going to look at a 12-month time horizon, then roll the dice and go and have some fun in the Gold Coast real estate sector or something of that nature, where you have a boom and bust market. That's really not the domain of MaxCap, nor of a lot of the more experienced developers that we partner up with. So when I think about it on a broader scale, I think the big change there is more so the build to rent sector and the effect and the potential change that has, because of course I think Australians have grown up with almost a birthright, which went back to probably the baby boomer generation of having a quarter acre block, right? And ownership, even for the Gen Xers, was the only thing that mattered, right? You had to own your own house or apartment. I'm seeing a shift now, right, in the Australian psyche from ownership to the rental market, and it's really going to be the catalyst for that, I suspect, will be this build to rent market if it can get up ahead of steam, which it's clearly struggling with presently.
Alton, Ash Morgan's done a fantastic job in basically recreating Docklands District with the introduction of Woolworths, H&M, Uniqlo, Hype DC, and many other major retailers, and driving that traffic with a lot of entertainment there. COVID has probably knocked that center around a little bit. What are some of the ideas of how to bring it back and when? And also, where do you see the retail market resetting itself once Melbourne wakes up?
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things going on down in Docklands. So a couple of things that are going to sort of play in our favour is the amount of development happening around us, and we sort of always knew this was coming. Docklands Primary School opens in January. Hopefully the kids can go back to school. One would assume that's going to happen. There's about 700 kids that'll arrive there first week of February next year. In addition, the Marriott, the first 5-star Marriott in the country for I think 20 years, opens in a similar time, a little bit earlier than that. There's just a massive amount of development happening around us. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is that we really only launched the fresh food component really in March, which was in the middle of the first stage of the pandemic. So most of Melbourne isn't even aware of what's happened down there. And so we really haven't had a chance to sort of talk to the market about what's down there, the fact that we put a roof over most of it, the fact that you've got probably more entertainment there than you do at some other centres or even at the casino, with the cinemas, the ice rink, the microbrewery, the Fun Lab group. So I think there's all of that entertainment and F&B piece, and I think the opportunity for us is to get some clear air post-pandemic to talk to Melbourne about what's there. I think what's been interesting for us is we're working with some retailers at the moment who are combining some last mile logistics and retail down there, given its proximity to the CBD and its connectivity to the road network. We're seeing certain retailers looking at using the space down there to retail out of, but actually fulfill for certain areas. And we've got a couple of tenants that are opening up post-pandemic and doing that. But look, it's been pleasing over the last few months to see how well the fresh food, in spite of all the lockdowns, has performed. And we're excited about the future. There's a lot of good stuff down there. And the other thing is that it's an indoor-outdoor experience, which, post-pandemic may be attractive. As far as retail generally, look, there's no doubt retail has its challenges, but I think there's some elements of it which are a little bit overdone, but some elements need to be looked at really closely. And, people are talking about rents and coming back. And yeah, in certain sectors, absolutely, the rents have got to come back. But the rents for food court tenants, they're affordable. Most food courts pre-pandemic were full with waiting lists. And we're talking about the good quality ones. The supermarkets aren't paying too much rent. Most of the other retailers, the rent levels were appropriate. There's massive disruption through fashion, and that's really going to play out. And there's an excess amount of retail space. So if retail space can be repurposed, and the retail space in some of these key centres can be reduced, I think the future is bright for well-located real estate, and I think that's the key. I think the centres that are really well located and are hubs of activity outside of just the retailing, and they bring in mixed use like residential and office and maybe potentially last mile logistics, which is happening all over which is happening in Europe, happening in America. That they'll see a rebirth. There's obviously going to be properties which are going to fall by the wayside, and it's going to be very challenging for some owners.
The shopping centers of just a single standing shopping center, from what we're being told, that's not going to happen again. Anyone building a center, they're building it around a hotel, residents, office workers, and parks and schools, and they're bringing it all together. So mixed use is becoming very much a part of what shopping centers fit into now.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the trends overseas, it's all mixed use.
Yeah,
you've got to have your hotel, you've got to have office, you've got to have residential. You've got to give people a reason to shop. People don't have to go out of the house to shop. You've got to give them a reason to go there. So, I think it's really going to be very interesting times. There'll be like in other sectors, there'll be a flight to quality. I mean, what we're seeing anecdotally across the market outside of, and I stress outside of Melbourne, because it's a different experience at the moment, is a flight to quality.
Gentlemen, just wrapping up now, and thank you very much for coming on. But before we do finish, we just want to quickly go around and ask you, what is the one biggest opportunity in the next 12 months?
Look, the biggest opportunity we see in the next 12 months is being able to potentially buy assets that wouldn't have come to the market in normal circumstances. I think what you see in periods like this is a different kind of decision making taking place by asset owners, and be it listed or unlisted businesses, making decisions about restructuring portfolios that weren't taking place prior to this crisis. So we see the opportunity for us is to get hold of some interesting assets through this cycle, and that's what we're very attuned to.
Wayne?
Well, I think if you're talking, depends what type of side of your portfolio. If we're going to talk about the defensive part of your portfolio, cash is trash. I don't think the bond market's particularly interesting. And of course, I'm going to talk up real estate debt, but it is an incredibly strong risk-adjusted return if we're talking about over the next short period of time. But on the other side, I'm looking at what a lot of the smart developers are doing. And it's interesting to me to see quite a few of them looking at repositioning assets, but with a very strong ESG focus. And so that's clearly a point of differentiation. And clearly that's where a lot of the institutional capital is migrating.
Shane?
Well, I think for us, we're going to really try and hone and stick to our fundamentals. And again, in a crisis, you have to pivot, but understand your core fundamentals. Ours is about finding and extracting value. I think we really want to hone our skills when we're entering an asset and purchasing as to what's our competitive advantage. How are you going to be able to lease that space or attract the income into the building opposed to everyone else. It isn't just about buying well, which is going to be tough because the world is awash with liquidity and it continues to be awash with liquidity. So it's going to be looking for a home. So I think as businesses, we're honing our skills back to what it is that we're good at, having a competitive advantage and being aware of what's going to differentiate you in the market, and really look for things that are land rich rather than improvement rich, because disruption's coming to all sectors. So if you have great quality land that you can pivot that asset to, and you've got a competitive advantage to extract value, I think you'll do very, very well. But again, for us, we think there's a bit of a delay. We think Easter next year we'll start to see some real opportunity, but time will tell.
Thank you, Alton, Wayne and Shane, coming on today. It was such a delight to talk to you.